All right, we're a couple minutes past the top of the hour, but we've got a lot to get through. We've got a lot of people still logging in. We had about 1,200 people registered. Looks like we have about 600 logged in, but we'll go ahead and start today's presentation. Welcome everyone to today's Title Topics webinar. These are Alta's free presentations offered every month on issues important to title professionals. I'm Jeremy Yowie, Alta's Vice President of Communications, and today we've got a fantastic webinar with some great content that's going to dig into data security and strategies to protect non-public personal information. Before starting, I just need to touch on a few housekeeping items. I'll try and burn through this really quickly. A copy of today's presentation was emailed earlier to all registrants. If you didn't get it, you can download the presentation from the handout section on the GoToWebinar panel. And if you're listening by audio, shoot me an email at jyowie@alta.org. That's jyohe@alta.org, and I'll send you a copy of the presentation after the webinar. All participant lines are muted for today's presentation. If at any time you have a question, please use the chat box function. We'll hold some time at the end of the presentation to address questions. As an added benefit, today's presentation was being recorded. Hold on here. Well, it doesn't look like the recording function is taking hold, so I apologize. We'll see what happens. It may not be recorded. I need to thank Fidelity for sponsoring our Title Topics webinars this year. Their support allows us to continue providing these educational opportunities free of charge. With that out of the way, let me quickly introduce our speakers. First, we have Chris Gulotta. Chris is founder and CEO of Real Estate Data Shield. Next, we have Chris Hacker. Chris is co-founder of ShortTrack. Also offering insight today is Todd Hougaard. Todd is president and founder of BeesPath. Also joining us is Rob McDonald. He is Chief Solutions Architect for Virtue. And finally, we have Steve Russo, Executive Vice President at CertainSafe. As you can see by the agenda, we've got a lot to cover. Sorry I bored you for the first few minutes here. Hopefully today's presentation is going to give you a better sense of why you need to protect NPI, how to protect data from various threats, and how to pick a solution from the many options that are available. And with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Chris Gulotta, who can get into the meat of today's presentation. Chris, I'll give it to you.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks to our colleagues at Fidelity for sponsoring this, and for all the folks at Alta that work so hard to put these great presentations together. And I also want to thank the highly regarded experts we have as panelists for joining us today. All right, Jeremy, can you start advancing the slides?
Yeah, we're on the importance of protecting NPI.
Okay. So our agenda today includes the importance of protecting NPI, cyber threats, compliance, what's considered NPI, and where can it be found, how to protect it, selecting a solution, market trends, and retention/disposal of NPI. So with regard to the importance of NPI, the first thing I want to make clear is what NPI is, non-public information. It's also referred to NPPI, non-public personally identifiable information. What we're trying to safeguard and protect here, and what we're required to safeguard and protect, isn't the Coca-Cola secret recipe or some secret patent. What we're simply trying to protect is a consumer's non-public information that, as title and settlement agents and as attorneys, we traffic in, both digitally and physically. So think of as the data moves from the bank through our offices to the borrower ultimately, and back and forth and in other directions to other parties, related professionals in that process, both physically and digitally. How are we safeguarding it? And the reason it's important to protect NPI is you have to realize that for the privilege of dealing with a consumer's non-public information, we also have a corresponding obligation to safeguard it. And it only makes sense for all of us that have filled out 1003s and gone through the mortgage application. We know that we put down on that 1003 and on many other documents like tax returns that we submit our most private confidential information, the kind of information a cyber thief or a fraudster would just love to have and can monetize very quickly and do us a lot of harm through identity theft. And the same way that we would expect a lender and all their third-party vendors to safeguard it, so too do we have the obligation to safeguard it. And the big picture is that in our world where we have mounting regulatory pressure on lenders and on us, we have to remember that if we are the reason for a data breach, it's very unlikely that our trusted business partners will view us as a trusted business partner. So very important to demonstrate that you've achieved a compliance posture that's compliant with the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act and with the FTC regulations and state data breach notification requirements, and that you're able to evidence that. And it's not just the evidence of it that's important, it's the actual compliance with it that helps you avoid what could be a business-threatening event. You have potential lawsuit exposure, you have fines and penalties from the regulators, but more importantly, in the context of a data breach, you have to bring in forensic experts, you have to identify the source of the breach, you have to notify certain parties, you have to send out data breach notifications. That whole process is not only very expensive and time-consuming, but again, it can be a business-threatening event. And imagine letting your lender client know that you've had 7,000 consumer files exposed and that their name was on that as well as the lender. I think it's very clear that they'd have to move you from their on list to their off list relatively quickly. And there's also the negative press that goes with that and your reputation. So the reputational risk is more than significant. It can be almost business ending. So when you think of network security, I want you to think of it in three ways. When you think of how to protect NPI, network security, physical security, and administrative security. And we're going to go through a whole bunch of great issues in here today. And I'd like to pass it off now to Todd.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about this important topic. One of the things that is important for people to understand is that the thieves are very well financed and very sophisticated and very well structured in what it is that they are attempting to do when they're out there trying to take advantage of computer systems. Because so much of the information that is fundamental to our industry and to our business is based on the information that we have. People are after it. And these are just some examples we have here on the screen just to give you an idea of the size and scale of the problem. So you can see here that Experian, which is of course one of the credit reporting agency, a very sophisticated company and deals with obviously enormous amounts of information, that in their case they did have a server that was exposed. It did not get to the core of their data repository, but instead had to do with their business interactions with T-Mobile, another trusted partner. But it resulted in the exposure of sensitive data from more than 15 million people. Another one that was earlier this year is a company called Anthem. If you're not familiar with them, they are the second largest provider of healthcare related systems, and so very, very large company. And you can see 80 million individuals had information exposed with a lot of sensitive information there. JP Morgan Chase, who is the largest bank that we have in the country, that in the breach that they had, that it affected more than 76 million households and small businesses. It's interesting in this particular case that when they first first talked about it, they thought it was about 1 million that had been affected. But as they continued to research how far that the perpetrators of the attacks had gotten, they found that it was in more than 80 different servers and systems that they had access to, and in some cases had very high-level access into those systems. So a very sophisticated attack that took place over a prolonged period of time in order to access this information. One of the things that they've continued to maintain is that they're spending more than $250 million a year on their cybersecurity activities in order to prevent that sort of an attack. And then Home Depot, just as another example, and this one was getting credit card information, but just as an example that the people that are out there looking for information are attacking at all levels, and they have the resource and sophistication to get into very large and very well protected systems. The title industry, of course, is not immune to these sort of activities. Some of you may have even seen some of the fraudulent activities of emails, for example, that have been intercepted or other information related to a transaction that's been hacked. And the attack angle that the bad guys are taking is to try and use that to persuade people to send money to a fictitious location. It happens in the title industry, and recently there was an announcement coming out, an article about how that same approach is being used against actual consumers and trying to get them for their transaction to wire the information, again, to a fictitious location. And then one that I've actually been seeing this one recently with some of the folks that we work with, that emails coming through and having links in them that appear to be to a Dropbox type of message, but indeed they're actual fictitious and are people that are trying to perpetrate crimes. So the threat is very real. It's not based on any information that we see. It's not subsiding. If anything, it is increasing. The sophistication with which the bad guys are leveraging to try and do this is not decreasing. And as the title industry, we deal with large sums of money and lots of money, and we should certainly anticipate that the criminals are going to continue to try and attack our industry, and we do need to be vigilant. So with that, we'll turn it back over to Chris.
Real quick, Chris and Todd, Chris Hacker also, he said he had another example he wanted to add here.
Yeah.
So Chris, go ahead.
I just wanted to toss in there real quickly. This is an emerging one. I've just heard anecdotally about, so I don't have any high-profile stuff related to it, but it's actually using encrypted email against the recipient. And depending on the delivery methodology, you get an encrypted email, you don't know what it's in, what it's about, what's in it, that sort of thing. And so there has been some attempts to try to do embedded stuff where it gets you to open the email, unencrypt the email and open it where you might not have otherwise. So while encrypted email is an important solution, there is potentially a new risk vector there as well.
Risks everywhere. All right, Chris Gulotta, you want to get us into some compliance issues here?
Great. Sure. So in terms of compliance, we really have to think of the sources of compliance as coming from a number of levels. It all started on the federal level back in 1999 when the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act came out, which went effective in 2001. So it all started then where a consumer was given the right to privacy, and the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, was tasked with the enforcement of those rights and with the development of rules to support the enforcement of a consumer's right to privacy. And over the next 6 years or so, the FTC developed their privacy rule, their safeguard rule, and their disposal rule. And in a nutshell, the privacy rule speaks to requirements that companies handling non-public information have a privacy notice, that they disperse and distribute that to new clients and consumers. And by the way, on your website and in the privacy notice you share with your clients, be mindful to live up to what you say. Do not use a sample form of a privacy notice that's a perfect notice and assures the recipient that you take every measure to safeguard information if you don't in fact do that. Because the FTC, when they've come in to investigate, looks at the privacy notice, and if they find out that through their audit and investigation of your operation that you failed to live up to what you said in your privacy notice, they can also hold you guilty of false and misleading conduct. The safeguards rule is really the nuts and bolts of how to comply with Gramm-Leach-Bliley and how to safeguard consumer information. And the FTC, if you go on their website, has really useful booklets that they'll mail you for free, and it explains in layman's terms how you need to be mindful of safeguarding customer information, and it gives you a lot of great useful tips and instruction. And then in 2005, the FTC came out with their disposal rule, and the critical thing here is to remember that they're not speaking just about paper. We all think about paper and Social Security numbers, loan numbers, bank account numbers, driver license ID numbers, and that's what we think about when we think of NPI. But what I'd also like you to think of is that information in digital form, whether it's a computer or a smartphone being cycled out, a hard disk that's being cycled out. You need to be mindful of disposing of that that information, whether it's in physical paper form or in digital form, properly. One thing I always remind people of here in our industry is that network copier, printer, scanner that you have, everything's on the hard disk in there, every image that's gone through there over the 2 or 3 years of your lease. So you should have that set to wipe daily, and you should ensure that when that equipment cycles out its lease ends, that you have a technician remove the disk and you have someone destroy it properly. But it's not just the federal level, the legislature and the regulators. It's also on the state level. Now 47 states have developed data breach notification laws that require companies who suffer a breach or believe they've suffered a breach to notify certain authorities, certain parties related to the transaction. In the retail world, once you send out a data breach notification to a consumer, there's a 38% chance they will not do business with you again. And I believe that in our industry, with all the regulations that the banks are under, if you are the reason for a data breach and you notify the lender of that, when you notify the lender of that, I think there's nearly 100% chance that the lender has no choice but to move you to their off list. And then regulators are reminding lenders constantly that they are responsible for the acts of their third-party vendors. We saw this most clearly in the CFPB Service Provider Bulletin of 2012, where the CFPB, in so many words, told the lenders that they're strictly liable for their third-party vendors. And we also saw that in the follow-up bulletins from the OCC, the FDIC, and the Federal Reserve, where they also spoke to managing the risk of third parties. So the regulators are putting pressure on the lenders. The lenders have to push that down to us because they're responsible for us. We are independently regulated on a state level through data breach notification laws and in the federal level through Gramm-Leach-Bliley. And as you all know, to support our industry, Alta developed their best practices, and best practice pillar 3 is the pillar that specifically addresses information security compliance and speaks to the need to adopt and maintain a written policy and information security program to protect non-public personal information as required by local, state, and federal law. And now I'd like to pass it to Steve.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for everyone for joining today. Before I get started in talking a little bit here about what's considered NPI and some of this type of information, Christian made some very good points. Data breaches seem in today's world to be somewhat inevitable. There are ways that you can protect yourself, protect your firm. It begins with doing the basic blocking and tackling. And if you just do some of those things, it's going to give you a tremendous edge against some of the major security threats out there. You heard Chris and some of the others talk about malicious emails coming through, encrypted emails. When you click on emails, you need to make sure that in your firm you have a policy in place that if you don't know where an email is coming from, you shouldn't be accepting it. Always ask a question. You're better off not opening it than opening it. The other point that I want to just mention here, you have a group of great people on this call, industry knowledgeable experts. Most all of you on the call, being in the title industry, you're not expected to be cyber experts. I would suggest to you that you reach out and lean on professionals in the industry to help you do the right thing. it's challenging enough to process title, move the money, deal with the lenders, and all the things that you do on a daily basis. You're not expected to be the cyber expert. So reach out, get some help. You can reach out to any of us that are on this call here. We're happy to help you. There's a wealth of knowledge available to you. And thank you to Alta and Fidelity for bringing us on the call and making us available to all you wonderful people. And the good news is you're taking the right steps. You're here on the webinar. That's a great step in the right direction, and that you're paying attention. Okay? So I'll go ahead and move on to what's considered NPI. Of course, you have items such as Social Security numbers, account numbers, loan payoff, credit card statements, disclosure, settlement statements, all the things that you would expect to be NPI. However, there is some public information, such as name, address, telephone number, that when it's in a specific type of document, even though it may be public information, you can go look it up in white pages and find that information. When it's contained in certain forms of documents, we have to protect it because there's other information associated with it. So we do have to be very cautious and paying close attention to what NPI really is. Next slide, please. You heard Chris talk a little bit about some of these pieces, the Uniform Residential Loan Application. These are some sample documents here that include different types of this PII and NPI information, borrower tax returns, lender engagement letters, settlement statements, IRS forms, all sorts of various places that some of this sensitive information resides, and that we're either moving, transferring, working with, and have to pay attention to protecting those pieces of information. The days of sending these types of documents through standard email without any encryption are gone. If you're doing so, you're putting your company at tremendous risk. And if you are, I would strongly suggest you cease doing so immediately. Okay, next slide, please. NPI, as Chris mentioned, can be found both in physical locations as well as electronic media. From a physical standpoint, obviously you make sure that cabinets are locked, offices are locked, and you're not letting the wrong people just roam in and around your office to access some of these documents. Instill a policy that doesn't allow staff to leave documents just laying open on desks. That theoretically could be a violation. Some of this NPI on the electronic side can be found in computers, web servers, network services, cloud storage, of course. When you're storing data in these areas, which obviously the data has to be stored, I can tell you that our firm, as a general rule, believes that sensitive data doesn't necessarily have a place residing on improper devices or in improper locations. While we're in a mobile world, we certainly take the stand that sensitive data does not ever belong on a mobile device or a tablet or even a laptop for that matter. Those types of devices should be utilized as a portal and not a place where some of the sensitive data is stored. There's too big of a risk for one of those devices to be lost, stolen, and or hacked. When you get into email services, we heard just a little bit ago on some of the downfalls on encrypted emails, in that you can still get yourself in trouble. You can be set up, you could be spoofed to open an email that's malicious. And not only do you see some of these hack attempts to put some of this bad stuff on your computer, but I'm sure we've all heard in the news some of the ransomware that's out there, where they literally take that data, that information that's on your system, and lock it up and encrypt it so you can no longer get to it. Those are some other types of threats that you need to watch for through email. Instant messaging services, same type of thing. Watch out for the links. Pay attention to what you're clicking on. Backup takes, online services. faxes. Fax is a very interesting item to take a look at. For years, everyone's depended on faxes as being a reliable method of secure communication. Well, I'm here to tell you that it's not. And I would strongly suggest everyone take a look at your fax practices. Faxes can be intercepted, unquestionably. Faxes can be spoofed. You could receive a fax that looks like it's from your lender, and it may not be from your lender, even though it's got his phone number, his letterhead, his logo, and all of that information. If something is looking amiss, pick up the phone and verify it. Ensure that that fax is genuine, because the reality is, as Chris eloquently stated, it may only take one breach to put your firm out of business. With that, I thank you for your time, and I will go ahead and pass it on to Todd.
All right, so one of the other things that you need to be thinking about in terms of protecting the information that your company is handling is not just all of your computers and the technology that you have, but other ways that people may be trying to get access to your data and to your information. So, real world example, just last week, get a phone call about dinner time, and I answer the telephone, and it's a person claiming to be from Microsoft Windows Corporation. And I thought, this is a great opportunity. I'm going to see what it is they have to say, to see what it is they came up with. And they proceeded to tell me that I had viruses and malware and all these other things on my computer that I needed to go sit down at my computer, and they were going to help me clean it up. So since I'm fairly savvy, I like to think, in this industry and these sort of things, it was a great opportunity for me to listen to them and see how far I could bait them along before finally I just said, you're wasting my time. But they were not going to hang up. So as you think about opportunities for your company to be vulnerable, you need to think about your people and what it is you can do to try and prevent that from being an area where you can be vulnerable. And some of the best ways to do that is through training of your people. Let them know of the different things they can and can't do. For example, if they're getting a phone call from someone, they should never follow instructions from that person to go to a particular website, because they may be installing some form of malware or bot or some other vulnerability. The data that's out there shows that of the breaches that occur, that nearly 2/3 of them involve a human at some level that is providing some type of access into the network or access into the information. So your humans are oftentimes one of the weaker links, and it's one that you simply just can't ignore, and that you have to be proactive with, reaching out and training and educating your people. So with that, we'll turn it back over to Chris.
So briefly, if I can comment on the human thing, there was a couple of comments from before. The first one is that you have to have policies, right? I mean, should have been drummed into everybody's heads at this point. If you don't have a policy, you can't play. But having a policy in and of itself isn't sufficient. You have to have a policy that's actually implemented and one that's enforced. You have to have a pattern of doing that. You need to document it. Not only, and beyond that, you have to have a policy that's actually able to be followed. So, being able to have the world's tightest, greatest policy, but if it's not something that a human being is likely to actually comply with, it's worthless as far as the practical matter goes. The other quick comment that I wanted to pop in there was, everybody's familiar with the various kinds of NPIs described by Steve a minute or two ago, and went through all the lists of what places it lives. Some of the places people don't think about, and this is straight off the FTC's website, is lists of your customers, if they are derived in part from NPI, are themselves NPI. So, if you put together a list of your customers that has their phone numbers on there, well, your customers' names and the phone numbers themselves may very well be public information. but the fact that they're associated together by you as the customer is, one of those things that is NPI. So with that, are you able to advance the slide, Jeremy? Perfect. All right, so basic blocking and tackling, for what Steve said before. Basic security policy. So passwords. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is not a good password. I think we all know that. That doesn't mean that nobody's using something that's very simplistic. You should be using tools to require your employees to use passwords that pass strong encryption requirements. Everybody's got to have their own password and shouldn't share them. They need to be changed with some frequency. It doesn't mean that they need to be changed every 30 or 60 days, but you shouldn't have the same password for a year. Yeah, the rest of these things here about locking out access, about when you are walking away from your desk, those are things that are common sense, but they need to be enforced back to the policy. Requiring your employee to lock the computer every time they leave is not reliable. But having the computer lock itself after a period of time when it's not been used is reliable. So looking at things where you can automate those types of things. Establishing guidelines for internet usage and installing software, articulating penalties and enforcing those penalties for violating those policies are all, as I said before, important things. Next slide. With respect to dealing with handling NPI electronically, internally in your systems, at your office, where your computers and servers live, you need to have firewalls. So firewalls are often a combination of hardware and software that doesn't allow inbound connection requests to connect unless they are contain the right set of information. Then you need to have firewalls inside the firewalls, because no firewall in and of itself is guaranteed to provide complete protection. The mobile devices are a key thing that we've been talking about. So on the mobile devices themselves, the device needs to be encrypted. If it's used for business, the device needs to be encrypted so that when it gets turned off or somebody reboots it to try to get access to it, they can't without the password. Once they're in there, though, you need to have software that you're using that could contain NPI to be encrypted, or use applications that don't store that NPI locally. So it's something you need to talk to your vendors about how that's handled. And then lastly, when things go missing, part of that compliance process is tracking it, because that's a potential data breach. And then with respect to your Wi-Fi network, you need to hide it. That doesn't mean that you can't have a guest network, but you need to have a physically separated guest network so that when somebody is given access to the internet, they're not also given access to your intranet. So a lot of routers these days have 2 or more networks that are separate and distinct and that don't connect to each other. And then also make sure that you change the default administrative password. Probably about half the time these days still, you can connect to a router, hit the right IP address, put in admin as the username and the password, and you can go and start changing settings. You don't want that to be your router. So with those things covered, that handles everything except for the next step, and I'll hand it over, I believe, to Rob.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. A lot of great information today. I think it's hard to consolidate a lot of this information as you start thinking about protecting your content, reaching out to experts to understand what you need to be doing. One of the most difficult things to do is to pick a solution or a combination of solutions, as there's no one silver bullet for security today. One thing I like to focus on, though, is before we get to that stage, is fundamentals. Where is my data? Data classification. One of the most valuable things you can do as an organization is to undergo an exercise, and periodically, organizations change, they evolve, processes change, that data created by those processes change. But the most important exercise that an organization do, one of the most important, is to undergo an exercise to understand where your data is, how that data got there, and the whole chain of custody of that data as it goes through your organization, right? So that's something called data classification and data flow diagrams. And what that's going to be able to allow you to do is understand the type of data, the risk profile of that data, and the risk should be a combination of likelihood of compromise and the impact if there were a compromise of that data. And as you understand the risk profile of that data, where that data is, how it got there, you can then start deciding how to protect that content at each of those points along the way. You know, Steve, Todd, and Chris had some amazing points about awareness. So over the years, the time I've spent doing penetration analysis for organizations, the vast majority of the time we gained privileged access to organizations where we could exfiltrate content without ever touching a technical exploit. We did so through the human resources aspect of the company, right? We were exploiting weak processes. We were exploiting awareness issues inside the organization. So I think also before you get into picking technical solutions, it's important for you to undergo some process validation. And that process of validation allows you to elevate your staff so they understand what is the input of this process, what is the output of this process, so they can better identify someone attempting to utilize them to exfiltrate just enough information to build a larger attack on your organization. So there's a lot of great experts on this webinar today that focus on a lot of awareness and as well as the technical side, and I really emphasize to this group that you spend the time understanding your organization and your employees as well. And so now that we kind of know, now that you've undergone that and you kind of know the type of data, where that data is, how it got there, and where it's going next, is protecting those communication paths, right? Those communication paths could be email. They could be file sharing internally. They could be collaborative ecosystems outside of your organizations through SaaS providers. It's just a very common thing today to share data in off-premise ways. And there's a lot of ways to secure that, right? You can undergo end-to-end encryption tools, which protects the content where you're creating it. This is a way to ensure that wherever it's stored along the way, it's protected, and you don't have to vicariously trust every data persistence path along the way. Portal-based security, where you're utilizing a third party. You're trusting them, and that third party is going to secure that content and give recipients secure access back into it over an encrypted channel. A lot of ways and a lot of technologies available today like that to protect this data once you know where it's at in the risk profile of that data. And then you got to ask yourself, implementation, right? So now we know that large organizations like Target or like Anthem, who spend millions of dollars every year on information security, even they're getting exploited. So you got to think to yourself, well, I can't afford to choose every solution under the sun. So that's why it's really important for you to focus on the classification of risk for each of that data so that you in turn can make a solid business decision from a budgetary perspective and choose an implementation that is appropriately sophisticated for your company, right? It should be directly correlated to that risk profile of your data and the proliferation of that data inside your company and out of it. Next slide, please. Great. So classification. Now that we know where the data is, now that we know how it flows through your organization, and now that we've hopefully assigned a risk rating to it that is aligned with your industry, right, and your business in general, so everyone undergoes little different processes, but somewhat similar in common verticals like this. Now that we know this, we can move on to selecting a provider. And choosing a provider is no small choice. It's a marriage. It's the one that you're entering into to not only protect your client's data, protect your business's data, but it's also to protect your reputation. So some of the speakers in this call have rightfully pointed out that an exfiltration event is not just a penalty. It's not just a financial impact, right? There are impacts on your reputation that are very difficult and in many cases impossible to overcome. You could spend years if you suffer the initial reputational loss after the exfiltration. Now you could spend years just getting back the trust of the community, and it'll be up to you to do that. You're going to have to undergo a lot of due diligence. You're going to have to go undergo a lot of community outreach to ensure that you're conveying to them that you've taken this seriously and that it's your intention to protect this, moving forward. But it's important to take that very seriously, right? Choosing a provider, whether it's speaking to experts in a great community like this, reaching out to other information security communities to choose a provider that understands what you're trying to do every day. It's important to do that due diligence, to understand who that company is, understand they have longevity and the expertise to be able to translate your business use case scenarios and your regulatory compression into a long-term plan. And that long-term plan should include a long-term relationship, right? This organization, these providers, these tools are going to be with you for a long time. It's not something that we're making quick decisions on. Next slide, please. So great. So just real quickly going through what we've talked about so far, just a little more detail on some items that you can choose to protect your content today. Email and file sharing here on this slide is just a few ways in which content can transit through your organizations, get sourced inside or outside your organization. Ultimately, up to you to protect. It's your requirement to do so, right? So all the systems in place today to encrypt or protect that content are going to focus on a number of things. They're going to focus on protecting that data as it's in motion, right? So what does that mean, right? So as you send an email, right, and when you click send on that email fundamentally leaves your computer, goes across a network, ultimately going to leave your network into other systems that you don't control, right? So data in motion, protecting that data in motion is utilizing protocols like SSL or TLS, which produce a conduit, an encrypted conduit, as that data goes through that conduit from email server, for example, to email server. It's encrypted while it's in motion, and that's really important, of course. But data in motion or protection in motion fundamentally requires you to trust points along the way that you may not have control over, right? So data at rest, the next point here is the concept of when that data reaches these points along the way, whether that's an internal file server, whether that's an email server you control, whether that's the recipient's email server, they ultimately have to store it. And while it's at rest, you want to ensure that it's protected, especially if it's of a high-risk profile. If that data were to be breached, what does that mean to you, right? So encryption for data at rest means encrypting it early and ensuring that wherever it's stored along the way, within reason, it's protected. So permissioning, file ownership control, file notations, these things are fundamentally administrative controls, right? Ensuring that you're not just handing out data that's accessible from anybody, right? In a very granular way, applying permissions to the data to only the individuals that need access to it, closing the scope of access. Will close the attack surface upon that data and give you the ability to ensure that only authorized recipients have it. Audit trails, really important, right? You're undergoing all of this due diligence. You're implementing all of these solutions, right? Nothing is perfect, right? So audit trails are really important for a lot of reasons, but two primary. One is if something does happen and there is a breach, whether that's a technical exploit or not, you can go back and replay that chain of custody along the way to see if there was a breakdown in process, a breakdown in technology. And audit trails are also really important for proving that you're doing what you say you're doing, right? So if that's a reputation factor as well. So not only from a regulatory perspective, but you need to be able to show the community I'm doing what I'm saying I'm doing. So these audit trails, these systems can and should provide for that facility. Next slide, please. So a concept that we should go into just a little bit. I spent a lot of time, and there's a lot of other good speakers here to chat about other items, but ease of use, right? If it's not an approachable solution, then it's going to impede what you do. So going back to the great points made earlier by the other speakers, is that your focus, your primary business is not information security, and it shouldn't be, right? You should choose technology that supports your business process and so protects your business. But if there's not an ease of use, if there's not a way in which to attempt to automate the protection or protection by default, you're going to find it difficult to enforce this with your employees, and in many times it could result in them circumventing the solution to get that job done, get that deadline met, right? So picking a solution that allows you to turn on protection by default. So here's auto encrypt, right? So choosing those data flow paths that need to be protected and enforcing that encryption automatically will greatly make it a lot easier for you to reach a security posture that will protect your organization. So really appreciate the time today, and I think I'll hand it back over to Chris.
Okay. First thing, thank you. The first thing I'd like to say is just simply go Mets. And after that, before I get to this slide, I just want to make a point that we've kind of alluded to, the panelists have. There seems to be a trend in our industry now as the pendulum swings and title and settlement agents start to appreciate that they need to embrace compliance and document it and evidence it and be transparent about it. There seems to be a trend towards getting a compliance wrapper around their firm, if you will, in whatever form. And the most important thing to remember is that your company has to actually be compliant. So as you've heard, having the best policies and procedures, having the best firewall and technical devices are all great. But the most important thing is to remember is that an auditor or a lender is going to come in and test that and see if it's actually going from the policy and procedure right down to your employees' behavior. So it's really critical that you educate your staff, you create a sense of urgency for compliance, you change their behavior, because in our industry we're largely out of compliance, almost 14 years since Gramm-Leach-Bliley went effective. So really important, you know, as you just heard Rob say, that your employees, that you have solutions that your employees actually do embrace, and that when a lender or regulator comes in and tests it, that they can see that. A simple example is if you have a policy and procedure that says employees can only use the internet for work-related websites, expect that a lender or regulator will come in and pick random workstations and go on the browsers and check the browser history and make sure that what you're saying you're doing, you're actually doing. Okay, moving along to document storage.
Hey, Chris, this is Jeremy. Just real quick, want to interrupt. Great points. Mandy, you said go Royals, so just wanted to get that in. But no, we are going to hold some time for Q&A at the end, but I've probably received 10 questions, 10 items on this one question about what if a lender won't accept encrypted email? What should a title agent do? What are the options? Anyone let's have some commentary on that, because I've received, you know, aside from this webinar, I've received lots of emails, you know, and our advice at Alta is the title company still needs to do their due diligence to prove that they have the capability to protect NPI, and so you still need to consider getting some sort of provider. Whether the lender will accept it, that's their decision to not protect the NPI, but you still need to make a business decision to protect yourself. Is there any other commentary that any of the speakers want to add?
I'd like to add something. This is Chris. I think it was either Todd or Rob who mentioned SSL and TSL, I believe it is, encrypted tunnel.
TLS, yeah.
Yes. So those are many lenders are adopting those kind of encrypted email tunnel solutions and working with their title and settlement vendors in that way, so that each email doesn't need to be encrypted.
And this is Chris Hacker. Just to add on to your question, or the answer to your question, Jeremy. It's not the big lenders that are like, although I have heard some of them as well, because they're actually distributed organizations, so they have a policy. But to our point, they're, or with Rob and Chris's points, earlier about the testing compliance, the individual location may not be in compliance with the lender's policy and say, no, I'm not going to take this, or I don't, send it to me some other way. That's where you need to have other options. A lot of people are going to fall back on fax, but as Steve was saying before, that's not in and of itself inherently secure. Both from the, I would say, low risk, but fairly easy for somebody who knows how to tap a line. But the other side of it is that NPI is sitting on somebody's printer, or it gets scanned and stored as an email. In which case, we just put it back in the same position it was in before we were trying to avoid email in the open. So then that leaves platforms, places to exchange that data, and you need to consider all of those options as far as talking about service providers, making sure you have a method to get the data to somebody securely, so regardless of what they're asking for, so that you can protect yourself when the regulator does come through and say, well, did you comply?
And so maybe we'll just talk a little bit, and we'll get back, Chris, to the retention and disposal of NPI. So what are options? So if a lender, earlier, faxes aren't secure, if a lender won't accept an encrypted email, what should a title agent do to share this information?
Right. So you need to have a portal to fall back on of some kind.
Online portal.
An online portal that will, but the key thing is it's not just any online portal. It's got to be one that meets the compliance criteria. So obviously you need to have the encryption. It needs to be something that you're connecting to securely. So the standard, HTTPS should be showing up for the SSL connection. But then the other piece is that it needs to be guaranteeing you that it's encrypting the documents, on when it's storing them, and that it's permission based, so that on the other end, as much as everybody's going to complain in the beginning about it, being able to have it be protected by a username and a password, and even ideally that username is the person who you're trying to contact's email, so they don't have to remember something extra. It's just a password, and they set that. So having that kind of authentication in place is the thing that protects. And honestly, I have the luxury of saying this because they're not my direct customers, but I don't want to log in and get the thing. Well, your choices are encrypted email or logging in and getting the thing, because otherwise you're asking me to expose myself to liability. Is a perfectly valid answer. I'd encourage you to rework the specific words and the tone, but that's basically they're asking you to expose yourself to do anything other than that. But what you want to do is you want to end up on as few systems as possible. So selecting on your end, a platform that you can use to share that stuff via a portal consistently will start to train those people when they work with you that that's how it's going to come if they're not going to take an encrypted email.
Right. I can envision, a title company and staff trying to remember, 5 username and passwords for various systems.
Jeremy, let me add one more item here, just as the people that are dealing with that, because it does come up very frequently. Use it as an opportunity to go and talk to those lenders. Pick up the telephone and have a conversation with them. Oftentimes their company will have a policy of some kind in place, but the individual end user that you may be interacting with may not be aware or may have forgotten. So it's actually an opportunity to strengthen a relationship. There are certainly some technology tools, but have the conversation with them, and perhaps it's there may be some education on their part, but it's a great chance for an agent to establish their professionalism by actually reaching out and having a conversation with a real human being.
That's a great point, Todd. And be able to offer them value, right? Like even if they're not aware of it, how can I help you become compliant? And if they are aware of it, but their solution's not working, being able to provide your solution as an alternative, is a possibility that adds value to that relationship.
Okay.
Hey,
great.
Jeremy.
Yeah, great discussion. Now, Chris, you want to wrap up the content with retention and disposal, and then we'll tackle a few more questions.
Hey, Jeremy, I want to throw one more thing in, if I may. Steve Russo. And it has to do with what Chris was speaking about, too, with regards to storing data and all of these things, picking a platform, solutions. There are solutions out there, ladies and gentlemen, that will allow you to store the data compliantly, share the data compliantly, audit the trails in the way that you need to audit them. So go out there and investigate some of those solutions, and I think Chris will give you some places that you can go look to find these type of solutions that is something that can solve a bunch of these problems all at once. I heard the statement, there is no silver bullet, but there are certainly alternatives out there that solve multiple issues at once. So take a look at some of those platforms out there, and they'll really help you out a lot. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. And just to wrap up that discussion and to address that question again, I know that many lenders do accept a TSL, a transport layer security connection with their vendors. So look into that. It's like a secure tunnel for email as well, just as a concrete answer. In terms of document storage, choose your service provider carefully. The same way lenders are responsible for our acts for the vendors, we're responsible for our vendors. So either yourself or one of your consultants or your IT consultant, have them look at the document storage service providers' privacy and information security postures, certifications. Make sure you're picking a good vendor. Don't pick the cheapest one. Consider conducting an on-site inspection of their facilities, especially paper storage. You definitely want to go on-site and see what kind of security practices they have. And what kind of designations they have. You want to ask if they do background checks on their personnel. Do they use security cameras? Most of these storage facilities not only have security cameras that people can see, that their employees can see, but they also have hidden ones. Do they disperse your files throughout the facility so that in the event of a disaster, if it hits one part of the facility, it doesn't mean any one client that's in that part of the facility suffers an absolute failure? Does your provider undergo their own compliance validation as well as third-party validation? Can they document the chain of custody in those files and in those documents? Do they index and retrieve them at the box, file, and document level? So take a look at that. Do they have 24/7 security and adequately protect from fire or flood threats? I know there was a major storage facility in New York City, specifically in Brooklyn on the water, that suffered a major fire, and I think on average each client lost only about 15% of their paper records because they had dispersed each client's documents throughout the facility. And so those are the things that you want to be thinking about with regard to document storage. And I'm going to finish up here, and then if we have time, I know Steve may want to add something. In terms of document destruction, again, you should include all media, print and digital. We talked about that. I recommend a shred all policy. Don't leave it to staff's discretion, especially at month end. Ensure that your network printer, hard disks, and all other hard disks and backup drives are properly destroyed. Remember, on those, you've got all the information for multiple years or months at some point. Locked on-site storage bins, that's how these document destruction companies work. They'll put one of these locked bins on your site. You'll put the documents in them, and your staff will every day, and they'll come every week or so and collect it. Make sure they're doing a regular pickup. Choose your document destruction carefully. Find out what kind of designations they have, what kind of staff training they do, what kind of background checks. And again, you don't have to do this. Make sure your consultant does, or your office manager, or someone looks into this. And then just ask these questions. Does your provider assess your document destruction practices in need a good document destruction company will actually come in, as well as a good document storage company, learn about your business, your unique needs, and come up with a plan for you. Do they undergo their own compliance reporting? Do they have a barcode for tracking locked on-site document bins? And that's it for my presentation. Jeremy, do we have time for Steve to make a quick comment? Or are we at the take question point?
Let's go ahead and slide into Q&A. We are at the top of the hour. Then we have a few concluding remarks. Just real quick, had a few people ask if we were promoting certain vendors. We do have vendors on today's call. They offer products and services. Alta isn't endorsing any of them. We encourage you to go out there, talk with various vendors, pick one that you like and you think is going to deliver a good service for you and your staff. As far as best practices, Alta does have its elite provider program, and a couple of the speakers, their companies are elite providers. But as far as endorsing, we are not endorsing any specific product. We're just trying to bring speakers to you to share information about Protect NPI. So sorry about that real quick. Couple of questions, we've got a lot coming in, just trying to pick out a few themes. We did hit the one about what happens if the lender won't accept encrypted email. Early on, Todd, you talked about Dropbox and how there were some emails spoofing Dropbox. Someone actually asked what Dropbox is. Todd, do you want to touch on that real quick?
Yeah, just very briefly, Dropbox is an online file storage service. And so documents can be uploaded there, and then other people can have access to them. And they do have some other capabilities where they can, for example, move copies of those documents to a different location. So the concern is that oftentimes when a person is invited to access a document, they get an email saying, hey, I've put a document up on Dropbox and you can access it with this hyperlink. The challenges from a security perspective is that there are people that are now creating fraudulent versions of that. So instead of really and truly going to Dropbox to get a document, you're being redirected to another location or to another server, or it may actually install malicious software onto your computer.
All right, thank you. You guys, I forget which slide it was, which speaker was talking about mobile devices. Any specific security apps that are out there that's common that people are using?
Mobile security is very difficult. This is Steve Russo. There's a couple of different applications out there. Many of them actually crash mobile devices. I can tell you that our firm certainly leans back toward the same philosophy, is that sensitive data does not belong on a mobile device. You should be using some type of a portal type system to access that sensitive data, therefore alleviating that risk. Millions of dollars are spent trying to protect mobile devices, and the reality is that there's many articles out there. I've certainly published several with regard to being able to access mobile devices very quickly, very easily, and take copies of people's devices without very little effort at all with them never knowing it. So that would be my take on mobile.
Okay.
And I'll add on real briefly. This is Chris Hougaard. That to Steve's point, being able to copy the stuff when a device is on does sort of defeat the issue around if they can get into your device while it's on, they don't have to turn it on and unbreak or undo the encryption. When it's on, it's not encrypted. The encryption, when you encrypt your device, if you go into your security settings and say encrypt device, what that's doing is it's encrypting the device and then it decrypts it while it's on, and then in memory. So that as a functional matter means if you turn your phone off or it runs out of battery and somebody steals it and tries to access it, there's just garbage in there. They can't do anything with it. But once it's on and the right password's been provided, at that point, it's not encrypted anymore. And so anybody who has access to that phone has access to the data on it. And that's why you have to be careful about the applications that you're storing, on there and the data you're storing. So that could be, to Steve's point, actual data documents, like taking a picture of, not that anybody would do this, but taking a picture of a 1003 and storing it on your phone is not a good idea. But the less obvious stuff is, is using applications, apps that you've installed that are accessing that data and storing the copies of those things locally. Well, great, you've got it encrypted up, on your server or on your service provider server, but is it encrypted on your phone? And if you don't know the answer to that question, the answer is probably no, in which case you're now not compliant again. So you need to be cognizant of that, and that's what's driving Steve's comments around that data probably doesn't belong on a phone unless you know for certain that it's being encrypted.
Okay. We'll take a few more questions. If we don't get yours specifically, we'll have the contact information for the speakers. Please feel free to reach out to them directly. Quite a few questions on where NPI is found and if any of the speakers consider title policies and title commitments to contain NPI. And I guess it could depending on what information is actually included in the document.
Yeah, I think that the best thing to do is download the webinar presentation because it is spelled out fairly well on a couple of the slides on where NPI can be found. It's hard to just rattle off, the 20, 25 places, but I think they're in the presentation. If the folks download that, they can have that and post it on their wall.
Yeah, I mean, in personal opinion here, you are right, Jeremy. It depends on the specific combination of information that's present in a particular document about whether or not it's NPI. I mentioned earlier about client lists. Could or may or may lists of public information, not NPI. Lists of public information that have been culled or merged with NPI data that you have becomes NPI per the FTC. So, given the ambiguity and the penalties associated with that, again, my personal opinion is that you're safest if you assume that if you're not sure, it's NPI, and just treat it as such.
All right, and one more, we kind of glossed over one of the slides. It was about file ownership control. Can any of the speakers touch on that? We have a few attorneys on the call and are interested in how that impacts them.
So file ownership or control, could you just be a little more specific?
Yeah, I'm trying to
I can take this. This is Chris Hacker again. I am an attorney. I think I know where they're coming from. So in terms of control, from a legal perspective, as an attorney, if I'm putting something into a system that is confidential, or contains NPI, which in the case of an attorney, it would be both, right? I need to know how that's going to be handled. I need to know that when I put it there, that I'm not disclosing things. And again, that's really, assuming that's the question, it's really about how the service operates. You don't want, you wouldn't go into a basic project management software solution and use that to share confidential information with everybody involved in the transaction, because that just doesn't work. You need something that's going to segment and partition the data and make sure that you have control over that. Similarly, to a less stringent extent, title companies and other service providers need to be managing, that privacy and permission-based architecture for the data or documents.
Jeremy, Chris Gulotta here. I'd like to add something specifically for attorneys. So attorneys are held to a higher standard, and what I recommend is that they look both under the ABA Model Code of Professional Conduct, Section 1.6, confidentiality, as well as their state Code of Confidentiality. Most states now have adopted the ABA Model Act, and if they look at Section 1.6, and more specifically, their state's comments to 1.6, the confidentiality obligation, it includes not just NPI, but all customer information. And the trend in those states now, the trend out there with the most progressive states is to require a safeguarding of information, a disposal of information, a safe and secure digital transmission of that information, especially when they know that the information could do harm to a client. And certainly emailing out 1003s or tax returns, a client's 1003s or tax returns at any time in the transaction is not a way of safeguarding it. So I'd recommend attorneys look at Section 1.6 of their state's Code of Professional Conduct, as well as the comments to it where they flesh out exactly what they're thinking.
All right. Thanks, guys. And just as a reminder, if you have some more technical questions, we do have a lot. Feel free to reach out to any of the speakers. Let me advance the slide, and it is in the handout. Everyone's email is right there. Just as a reminder, it looks like the recording did take, so if you missed parts of it or you think others in your staff would benefit from listening, we'll get the recording available after it's edited. Once that's done, it will be available on Alta's website at www.alta.org/title topics. Again, that's alta.org/title topics. Looking ahead, our next webinar will be Thursday, November 12th. We'll be discussing fourth-party vendor liability and address responsibilities title professionals when they're selecting service providers, such as abstractors, signing services, paper shredding companies, all the way to cleaning crews and others. So watch for registration information for that webinar. And with that, that will bring us to the conclusion of today's presentation. Thanks again to all the speakers for joining us and sharing information on NPI and the solutions out there. I hope all the listeners found today's presentation useful, and take care, everyone.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.